How much is a man worth when he has everything the world can offer, but loses the only people who truly knew him before he was anyone? It is a question that hangs heavily over the twilight of Paul Hogan, the man who conquered global cinema with a leather hat, a rugged grin, and a massive knife. At 86 years old, sitting in a quiet house near Venice Beach, California, he recently made a confession that stunned those who had followed his meteoric rise. He admitted, with the quiet vulnerability of a man who no longer has anything left to hide, that she was the love of his life. But the tragedy of Paul Hogan is not that he never found true love. It is that he found it twice, in two entirely different worlds, and managed to let both slip through his calloused fingers. Long before the global box office receipts reached $300 million, and long before the red carpets of Hollywood, Paul Hogan was just a young man with a heavy accent and zero ambition. He was born in October 1939, in the working-class suburb of Parramatta, in western Sydney. For years, he would tell journalists he was from Lightning Ridge, a rough opal mining town in the outback, simply because it sounded more poetic, more interesting, more like the myth he was already beginning to construct around himself. But the truth was far more ordinary. He left school early, without any academic honors, and found himself working as a rigger, suspended high above the water on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. To make ends meet, he also took a job as a lifeguard at the local swimming pool in Granville. And it was there, in 1958, that his life truly began. Her name was Noeline Edwards. She was 18. He was 19. Paul would later describe their meeting with a characteristic, no-nonsense simplicity that defined his entire public persona. He said, "I was a massive flirt, and I liked her, and she liked me, and we got married. That was it. There was no grand romantic gesture, no elaborate courtship, just two working-class teenagers who looked at each other and decided, with the fierce certainty that only teenagers possess, that they were enough for one another. They married in June of that year. Their first child arrived before Paul turned 20. By the time he was 22, they had 3 sons. They grew up together, scraping by on whatever wages the bridge and the swimming pool could provide. Noeline ran the household with an iron will and absolute devotion, while Paul put on his boots and went to work. They were, in the most literal sense, building a life out of nothing. Then, one evening in 1971, the trajectory of their quiet existence changed forever. Frustrated by a television talent show called New Faces, where arrogant judges routinely humiliated working-class contestants, Paul decided to audition. He did not go to showcase a talent. He went to heckle the judges. He walked onto the stage in his work boots, traded sharp insults with the panel, banged 2 shovels together, and walked off. The audience went wild. He was invited back the next week, and the week after that, a prominent journalist named Mike Willisey noticed the raw, unfiltered charm of this bridge rigger and gave him a regular segment on current affairs. By 1973, he had his own sketch program, The Paul Hogan Show, which ran for over a decade and became a massive hit not just in Australia but across the United Kingdom. The character he played was always the same, the ordinary bloke who refused to be impressed by anyone who thought they were important. But behind the scenes, the sudden wealth created a profound, disorienting friction. Paul would later call this transition the hardest thing he ever did. Harder than anything Hollywood would later throw at him. He said, "I was poor and famous, and that was uncomfortable." While Paul was traversing the globe, being adored by millions of strangers, Noeline remained at home in Sydney, raising their 5 children. She watched her husband become an icon from the inside, a vantage point where the glamour is completely invisible, and the only thing you truly feel is the empty space beside you in bed. By 1981, the strain became too much, and after 23 years together, they quietly divorced. Yet, the bond between them was stubborn. Less than a year later, realizing that decades of shared history cannot simply be erased by a court document, they remarried. It felt like a victory for the old life, proof that the rigger from Parramatta could still find his way back to the girl from the Granville pool. But then came 1985, and a script Paul had co-written about a crocodile hunter in the Northern Territory. To play the American love interest, the production cast a 27-year-old, Juilliard-trained actress from Connecticut named Linda Kozlowski. She had been recommended by Dustin Hoffman, who praised her work on Broadway. When Linda arrived in the harsh, sweltering Australian outback, she was completely unprepared for the reality of the shoot. Her basic hut sat on the edge of a swamp thick with crocodiles. During filming, a crew member stood nearby with a loaded Magnum revolver, just in case a predator decided to join the scene. Yet, despite her classical training and the brutal conditions, Linda never uttered a single complaint. Paul was instantly captivated by her resilience. The film's director watched them on set, noting that with each passing day, the two actors seemed to understand each other on a level that went far beyond the script. Paul's close friends saw it too, noting that Linda was deeply conflicted because she knew Paul was a married man with 5 children. But the gravity between them was simply unstoppable. When Crocodile Dundee premiered in 1986, it did not just succeed. It shattered records, grossing over $300 million worldwide. Overnight, Paul Hogan became a global superstar, and his marriage to Noeline was permanently shattered. The second divorce was not quiet. It was one of the most vitriolic, highly publicized celebrity splits in Australian history. The media forced fans to take sides, and Noeline, who had never wanted the spotlight, found herself hunted by paparazzi. Through the chaos, she maintained an extraordinary, heartbreaking dignity. She offered only one public reflection on the end of her marriage, saying, "I had the best years of his life." It was not spoken with malice, but with the chilling clarity of a woman who knew she had given him her youth, her labor, and her devotion when he was nobody, only to watch another woman inherit the empire they had built together. Following the final paperwork, Paul did not speak to Noeline for 17 years. 17 years of absolute silence, directed at the woman who had stood by him on the bridge. Noeline eventually found a quiet peace, marrying a businessman in the year 2000, and living a private, happy life away from the cameras until his passing in 2017. Paul and Linda married in May 1990 in Sydney. He was 51. She was 32. To the public, it was the ultimate Hollywood romance, the on-screen chemistry made real in the early years. Paul was completely infatuated, publicly declaring that Linda was far too good for him, and that she completely knocked his socks off. They traveled the world, flying across the Atlantic in a cloud of intense, unapologetic romance. But Hollywood is a brutal place for a marriage built on a single movie. As the years rolled on, the industry tried to pigeonhole Linda as merely the beautiful sidekick to a funny man. She turned down roles she found insulting, eventually acting in low-budget, straight-to-video films that she admitted gave her ulcers because no one on set seemed to care about the craft anymore. Eventually, she walked away from acting altogether. Their son, Chance, was born in 1998. And Linda tried to find contentment in the quiet life of a mother and a Hollywood wife. But stability came at a massive cost to her identity. Paul, despite his international fame, remained a deeply traditional, old-fashioned Australian man. He wanted a wife who prioritized the home. Linda had given him that, but in doing so, she felt she had completely disappeared into his shadow. She stopped existing as Linda Kozlowski and became merely Mrs. Hogan in October 2013. After 23 years of marriage, the exact same length as Paul S.'s first marriage, Linda filed for divorce. The settlement was massive, but the emotional cost was higher. Linda told reporters that after living in Paul S.'s shadow for so many years, it was finally time to feel her own light Paul, using the humor that had always served as his armor. Remarked that women seemed to last about a quarter of a century with him before they simply got bored. He noted that they were opposites in everything: the food they ate, the music they liked, the clothes they wore. Linda eventually moved to Morocco, married a local tour guide, and found a life that belonged entirely to her. Paul remained in Los Angeles, a city where he had few close friends, increasingly isolated. The later years were unkind. A grueling 7-year tax investigation by the Australian government drained his spirit, culminating in a bitter period where he was legally barred from leaving Australia to return to his home in America. Then came the physical decline. Muscle atrophy and chronic pain slowly wasted away the robust, athletic frame that had defined Mick Dundee. In the quiet of his old age, Paul finally let the armor drop for a brief moment, admitting, "I once had it all: fame, fortune, and a wonderful wife, but in the end, I still feel like I lost something most important." In December 2024, a frail 85-year-old Paul reunited with Linda for a restored screening of Crocodile Dundee, standing beside her under the flashbulbs, looking at the footage of their younger selves from 1986. Vibrant, beautiful, and desperately in love, Paul just smiled for the cameras. It is what he has always done when the truth hurts too much to speak aloud. He prefers to talk about the Hollywood memories that do not cost him anything, like the time Clint Eastwood joked with him at a dinner, or when Prince Charles and Princess Diana nudged his elbow at a royal premiere. Those stories are easy. The reality of his home life is not in May 2026. Police were called to his Venice Beach home following a domestic incident involving his 27-year-old son, Chance. An 86-year-old Paul Hogan was left standing on his front porch, speaking to officers in the pale California light, looking like a man entirely stranded by time. Today, Paul Hogan lives in the quiet space where a family should be. Across the world in Sydney, Noeline is at peace, having lived a life of quiet dignity. In Marrakech, Linda is living an adventure that is entirely her own. And Paul is left to walk the beach alone, wondering about the choice he made so long ago. When he says she was the love of his life, his mind most likely wanders to Linda, the American dream that captivated him in the desert heat. But those who have watched his journey from the beginning know a deeper truth, that Noeline Edwards was also the love of his life. The quieter kind, the deeper kind, the kind of love that stood on a bridge in the wind before the world ever knew his name, and the only kind that matters when the lights finally go down. What is the memory that stays with you the most when you look back at the grand, complicated life of Paul Hogan, and do you think the price he paid for Hollywood glory was ultimately worth it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another character study. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we will see you in the next story.